la mer qu'on voit danser le long des golfes clairs a des reflets d'argent, la mer, des reflets changeants sous la pluie. La mer au ciel d'été confond ses blancs moutons avec les anges si purs. La mer, bergère d'azur infinie.
Morning, everybody. We're in St. Augustine, Florida, and we're presently at anchor, not too far from the old city, the old part of town. We thought we'd talk a little bit about our trip here. We left from Beaufort and we went offshore around Frying Pan Shoals to Charleston, and then we stayed a couple days in Charleston, and then we went from Charleston down to St. Mary's, Georgia, and stayed a few days there, had Thanksgiving in St. Mary's, which was wonderful. There were about 30 boats there for a huge potluck Thanksgiving. After Thanksgiving, we left St. Mary's, went to Fernandina Beach, spent a night there, had dinner and looked around the old town, and then we came down to St. Augustine the next day. So that was the most of our short little trip. We really didn't go too far offshore. We went offshore about 25-30 miles at the most. So the first couple of days were the worst weather. We had forecast with windy that we were going to have 5-foot seas and 15-knot winds, and what we really had was 10-foot seas and 20 gusts to 30. So it was a little bit more than expected, but this boat's fine with that, and we were fine with it. We didn't get to film the 10-foot waves, but I'll tell you how you figure this out. My head sits almost, when I'm sitting here in the cockpit, my head sits almost exactly 6 feet above the water. So if I look at the horizon and a wave passes over the horizon, then I know that that's more than 6-foot waves. If I'm standing up, I know that I'm about 10 foot above the water. And once again, if I look at the horizon and a wave passes over the horizon, then I know that that's a 10-foot or greater sea. So you use the horizon and your height above the water to kind of estimate this a little bit.
We got 23 knots of wind. We're in the vicinity of Frying Pan Shoals. Between 6 and 10-foot swells.
The first part of the journey, we didn't have autopilot. The reason we didn't have autopilot was because some lead ballast had slipped down and gotten behind our hydraulic ram and our steering. And so I could only steer 8 degrees to port, and everything else was to starboard. So that made navigating the waves a little bit challenging, but it also meant that I didn't trust the autopilot, because at the time, I didn't know if I had an autopilot problem or if I had a steering problem. So I elected to hand steer it. So the first couple of days, we were completely hand steering, and we stayed up most of the night. We didn't film a lot of that, but by the time we get to Frying Pan Shoals, the waves had settled down to more like 5 or 6 feet, and the winds were still up there, 25 knots, so we were reefed both the main and the mizzen, and we were still doing 8 knots through the water, so it was plenty, and we weren't overpowering the rig at the time doing it.
That was before we had gotten the bottom of the boat cleaned like we had recently. So
yeah.
We were probably a whole knot slower than we would have been.
I've had the boat up to 9.5 knots before, so I don't know exactly why we were going that slow, but I agree with Sam. Our bottom was pretty dirty. When we got to St. Augustine here, we elected to have somebody check our zincs. We were going to do that before we left, but it didn't work out timing-wise. So we had somebody check our zincs and clean the bottom, and just motoring across town, we gained an extra knot. So it probably did slow us down a knot. Since we were sailing 24/7 and at the wheel with no autopilot, we did a lot of night sailing. And I've decided that I kind of really like night sailing. There's a peacefulness about it. You're not distracted by the waves. You can feel the boat, and you can almost steer blindly. When the sails start to flap a little bit, you steer a little bit in a different direction. So, you know, maybe a little off the wind or a little into the wind, depending on how it's heeling or how they're flapping. And you just sort of feel the waves, and you steer into the waves, and it's a lot easier to do. So I've decided I really like night sailing, but it was tiring. We kind of lived on 5-hour energy, Sam and I taking 4-hour shifts. By the time we were back around the shoals, then waves were down at 4 or 5 feet, and that's when you saw us, eating breakfast and lunch and playing with the cat, things like that. We had gotten the autopilot going while we were underway, so at that point we were on the autopilot, which is why you see us, walking around and nobody's at the wheel. A thing about our autopilot is that the wheel doesn't turn because it's hydraulic. The wheel stays steady. So the autopilot was functioning. We were really sailing, and the wheel just doesn't turn because the autopilot has its own hydraulic pump.
Funny story about the autopilot. Yes, we did have a ballast block blocking it, but we had also somehow pressed the breaker at the very back of the port lazarette.
Yeah.
That was on the actual autopilot box.
I'm remembering this now as that happens. The real reason that the autopilot didn't function at all was because of that circuit breaker. Once we had that functioning, then the autopilot worked, but we still couldn't steer more than 8 degrees to port. So that was also irritating. We actually got the autopilot going in Charleston. So the first leg of our journey, we didn't have the autopilot at all, and then we had the autopilot after Charleston. That was when we fixed it.
There's
I'll have 3. I'll put 2 in the bag. You might have to toss it.
I'm not tossing.
Why not? That ought to be fun.
I don't know if these are good or not, but there's 3 oranges.
Thank you very much.
I'm trying to work fast to get it.
Here's our nav station. Oh, that's Sam's scarf. It got soaked with salt water. We took a nice wave over the bow and got wet. We have a VHF and a single sideband. And off to the right, we have the control for the generator and also for the modem.
The beeping.
It was on night mode. So we can send email, we can get weather facts, we can talk on the single sideband nets. This is our inside chart plotter. We have an outside chart plotter at the helm as well. So this is what our boat looks like when we're underway. We put all the cushions there beside the settee so that they don't wash overboard. That's our fruit basket, other types of food. Lila spends most of the time up here. There's the bee berth. Hannah's sleeping. You gonna wave, Hannah? I guess not.
That is the weirdest sound.
Can I get by? This is the aft cabin. This is where Sam sleeps. This is my mom's bunk. And the aft head. This hand pump we have is switchable. It can go to our drinking water or to our salt water or to just regular freshwater tanks. There's a switch under the sink while it's rocking.